Welcome, everyone. I'm Dusky Nights, and before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Drop a comment below. Also, I want to know what kind of stories you enjoy, and make sure to listen till the end. Brad went out to check the fuse box. His flashlight fell. Something ran at him. He ran back, slamming the door. The fuse box. It's wrecked. That's when we knew. They didn't want us to go. The weekend was supposed to be fun. Just us. 3 friends from college. Had a cabin by a lake, relaxing after exams. The drive was long, but the view was great. A frozen lake stretched out, trees covered in snow all around. It was the only cabin there. No neighbors, no town, just quiet. The first night was fine. We laughed, stayed up late, and enjoyed being away. But the second night, the storm came. The wind shook the windows, and snow piled up fast, covering the porch. The cabin felt smaller, like it was closing in. I was half asleep when Dustin woke me up. He looked scared. "The motion light keeps turning on," he whispered. "I saw someone." I was still sleepy. "Are you sure?" I mumbled. He nodded. "Come see." We went downstairs quietly. The porch light turned on again, shining on the snow. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, a shadow moved, a tall shape, near the trees. I gasped. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Dustin looked worried. "Yeah. And there's more." Another shadow showed up, then another. They were moving in the trees, hard to see in the snow. My stomach hurt. I turned to get Brad, but before I could, one of the shapes came closer. It was close now, at the edge of the trees. The light turned on again, and for a second, I saw it clearly. A tall figure, face completely covered. Brad came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. "What's up?" he said. I pointed. "Look outside." He looked through the window, not impressed. "It's just the storm. You guys are freaking out." Before I could say anything, the light went out. The cabin was dark. Then, the power went off. The heater stopped. The fridge clicked off. The lights flickered and died. The only light was from the snow outside. I clenched my fists. "What the heck?" Brad said. Dustin grabbed a flashlight and turned it on, the light shaking. "The fuse box," I said. "It's outside, right?" Brad nodded slowly. "Yeah, but this is weird." Dustin swallowed. "Unless someone cut it." No one spoke. The cabin felt heavy. I felt scared. "We have to check," I said. Brad hesitated, then grabbed a big flashlight. "Stay here," he said. I'll be quick. He unlocked the door and went outside into the storm. Dustin and I stood there, watching. The wind made it hard to see, but I could see Brad going towards the side of the cabin. A few seconds passed. Then his flashlight fell. The light spun around in the snow and stopped. "Brad," I called. No answer. My stomach dropped. "Brad." Footsteps. Fast. Running. Closer. "Get inside," I yelled. A shadow ran at him. Brad ran back, slipping in the snow, barely getting through the door before slamming it shut. He was breathing hard, eyes wide. "The fuse box," he said. "It's destroyed. Someone smashed it." I felt cold. We were trapped. No power. No phone. A storm too strong to go through. And something was out there. We pushed furniture against the doors, grabbed kitchen knives, all we had. No one talked. No one looked outside. Every little sound made me jump. The wind howled, branches creaked, but we knew it wasn't just the wind. The night went on forever. I must have fallen asleep because suddenly it was quiet. The storm was over. The cabin was freezing. We could see our breath. Dustin still held the flashlight, half asleep. Brad was staring at the door. "It's morning," he whispered. His voice was rough. "We have to go." Slowly, we moved the furniture and opened the door a little. It was quiet outside. Everything was still, except for one thing. Footprints from the woods to the porch, all around the cabin. I felt sick. Dustin breathed shakily. "They were here all night," he whispered. Brad looked angry. "We're leaving. Now." We ran to the car, not looking back. As we drove away, Dustin looked in the mirror. He went pale. "Someone standing by the trees," he said. I didn't look. I didn't want to. We never found out who or what was outside that cabin. But we knew one thing. They didn't want us to leave. The car was spinning, tires screaming on the ice. My mom was yelling, and as I tried to get control, I saw it. A figure standing still in the snow, watching. My hands were frozen on the wheel, knuckles white, as the car slid. The headlights flashed against the snow, blinding me for a second before the car twisted. My stepdad shouted something, his voice sharp, but I couldn't hear over my heart pounding. I yanked the wheel, trying to keep us out of the ditch. The car lurched, twisting sideways, and Just when I thought we were going to crash, the tires grabbed the road again. The car jerked back. I took a shaky breath, my whole body stiff with fear. But then I saw something through the storm, a shadow, a figure, standing in the snow by the side of the road. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was just my imagination, the near accident, making me see things, but the shape stayed there, tall, still, half hidden in the snow. My throat tightened. The wind howled around us, the blizzard covering everything in white. But the figure didn't move. I forced myself to focus on the road, my hands trembling as I steered. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice rough. My stepdad glanced at me, his face worried. "See what?" My mom leaned forward, gripping the seat. "What did you see?" I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "Nothing. Just the storm." But I knew I was lying, because that thing, whatever it was, hadn't moved. It hadn't reacted to the wind, the snow, or the headlights. It had just stood there, watching. The storm got worse. The snow fell so fast. The road disappeared. My headlights barely shone a few feet ahead, swallowed by the thick white. Every few seconds, the tires slipped, the car fighting the ice. My chest was tight with worry. My hands ached from holding the wheel so tight. The car was quiet, tense. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wind, the car rattling, and my heart beating fast. And then, through the snow, I saw it again. Closer. My stomach twisted as I saw the same dark figure, now right by the edge of the road. I gasped. It was the same shape, the same height, but it had moved. There were no tracks leading to it, no footprints in the deep snow. It was just there, half buried, still as a rock. I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to admit it, but my hands shook on the wheel, my breath coming in short bursts. "There's something out there," I whispered. My mom shifted in her seat. "What do you mean?" I hesitated. "I keep seeing someone standing in the snow." My stepdad frowned. "It's just the storm. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. Focus on the road." But I knew it wasn't just the storm. My gut told me something was wrong. As we drove past, I forced myself to look forward, but I saw it from the corner of my eye. And then I knew what was wrong. It wasn't just standing in the snow. It was buried in it. The figure was half sunk into the snowdrift, like it had been there for hours, days. And yet, there were no footprints around it, no sign in the snow. My skin crawled. My instincts told me to drive faster. I gritted my teeth, my hands gripping the wheel harder. The rest of the drive was a blur. The storm raged around us, but my mind was somewhere else, stuck on what I had seen. When we finally got there, I pulled into the driveway, my whole body aching from the tension. I let go of the wheel, stretching my stiff fingers. My stepdad turned to me. "Good job with that skid. That was close." I just nodded. I could still see it. The figure, watching, waiting. The next morning, we found out the highway was closed. The blizzard was worse, trapping cars, and people had to be rescued. We had barely made it through. We were lucky. But deep down, I knew whatever was out there was still waiting. The drive home a few days later was even worse. The snow had stopped, but the memory of the figure was still fresh in my mind. Every shadow by the road made me jump. Every snowdrift looked like it could be hiding something. I kept glancing at the side of the road, half expecting to see it again. My parents tried to reassure me, telling me I was just imagining things, that the stress of the near accident had made me see things that weren't there. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't just the storm. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. As we drove past the spot where I had seen the figure, I held my breath, my eyes glued to the side of the road, and then I saw it again. It was in the same place, half buried in the snowdrift. But this time, it was different. It was closer, much closer. I could see it more clearly now. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me. I gasped, my hands shaking on the wheel. "It's there!" I cried. I saw it again. My parents looked at me, their faces worried. "There's nothing there," my stepdad said gently. "You're just imagining things." But I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever it was following us. The rest of the drive was terrifying. I kept seeing the figure out of the corner of my eye, always closer, always watching. I could feel its presence, a cold, chilling feeling that made my skin crawl. My parents tried to distract me, talking about other things, but I couldn't focus. My mind was consumed by the figure, by the feeling that it was getting closer. When we finally arrived home, I ran inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't feel safe. I knew that whatever I had seen on the road, it was still out there, waiting. And I was afraid that it would find me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, sounded like the figure coming for me. I kept imagining it, standing outside my window, watching me. I tossed and turned, my heart pounding, until finally I fell asleep, exhausted. But my dreams were filled with the figure, standing in the snow, its eyes fixed on me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I had to get away. I had to escape. I told my parents I was going to a friend's house for the weekend. They didn't question it. They thought I was still shaken up from the near accident, that I needed some time to relax and get my mind off things. But I wasn't going to a friend's house. I was running away. I packed a bag with some clothes and a few other things, and I left. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the figure, from the feeling that it was always watching me. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was far away from home. I found a small motel in a quiet town and checked in. I was exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure, wondering if it was still following me. The next morning, I woke up early and checked out of the motel. I didn't know where to go next. I just kept driving, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the figure. I drove for days, stopping only to eat and sleep. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't want to. I was afraid that if I told anyone about the figure, they would think I was crazy. I was starting to think I was crazy myself. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just seeing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real, that it was out there, waiting for me. Finally, I ran out of money. I had no choice but to go back home. I knew it was dangerous, but I had nowhere else to go. I called my parents and told them I was coming home. They were relieved to hear from me. They had been worried sick. When I got home, everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, and there was no sign of the figure. My parents welcomed me back, happy to have me home. But I knew it wasn't over. I knew the figure was still out there, waiting. And I knew that one day it would come for me. The door was open. The house was dark. And when the woman's shadow moved, her shadow did not. I froze on the steps, my breath catching, my fingers tight on the food bag. Snow swirled around me, the cold biting, but I barely felt it. Something was wrong, very wrong. The woman's voice was friendly, casual even, but she wasn't coming to the door. She stood out of sight, her shadow on the wall at the end of the hall. But when she spoke again, soft and polite, the shadow stayed still. A gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping me out of it. My gut told me to leave. I tried to sound normal. I'll just leave it here, I said, putting the bag down. Silence. Then, her voice again, a little firmer. No, please, just bring it inside. My heart pounded. Everything in me said no. I took a step back. It's fine, really. Have a good night. I turned, ready to run back to my car, but I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A face, a man's face, staring at me from the window. I went cold. He was standing in the dark room, barely visible through the frost, but his eyes were locked on mine. He didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. My stomach twisted, every instinct screaming at me to get out. My hands fumbled for my keys, my breath quick and shallow. I got in my car, slammed the door, and locked it. The engine started, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back at the house as I sped away, tires slipping on the ice. But I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door was still open, the food bag still there, and the man still watching. His face was in the window, no expression at all. I turned onto the main road, my heart racing, my mind full of questions. What had I just seen? Why was the door open in the storm? And why did she want me inside? I shivered. I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. I should have forgotten about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I walked around my apartment for almost an hour, my mind going in circles. The way the woman's voice sounded, too calm, too careful. The shadow that didn't move. The man in the window. Something was wrong, very wrong. My stomach churned as I grabbed my phone. I hesitated, then called. The police. I told them about the house, the voice, the open door, and the man in the window. The officer listened quietly. And then his words made me even more scared. That house is abandoned. It's been empty for months. I felt cold all over. Are you sure? My voice was barely a whisper because I saw the officer stopped me. We checked. No one lives there. No furniture, no lights, just an empty house. I held the phone tighter. My mind screamed that it wasn't possible, that I had seen them, heard them. They were there. But the officer's voice was firm. There's no one there. If you see anything suspicious again, call us. That was it. The call was over. I stood there, my hands freezing, my body stiff. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, staring at my window, my mind playing the scene over and over. The voice, the shadow, the man in the window, and the worst part, the thought I couldn't get rid of, the fear that ate at me. What would have happened if I had gone inside? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told a friend about the house, about the woman's voice and the man in the window. My friend looked worried. That's creepy, she said. You should probably just forget about it. But I couldn't forget. The image of the man's face staring at me from the window was burned into my mind. I kept thinking about what the officer had said, that the house was abandoned. It didn't make sense. I had seen them. I had heard them. They were real, weren't they? Later that day, I decided to drive by the house again. I knew it was a bad idea, but I had to see it for myself. I had to know if it was really empty. As I drove down the street, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The house looked the same as before, dark and silent. I parked across the street and got out of my car. The wind was still blowing, and the snow was still falling. I walked across the street and stood in front of the house. It was even creepier in the daylight. The windows were dark and empty, and the front door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The inside of the house was pitch black. I took a step inside, then stopped. The air was cold and stale, and there was a strange smell, like something rotting. I took another step, then another. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I felt like I was being watched. I turned around and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I got back in my car and drove away, my hands shaking. I knew then that the officer was right. The house was empty, but that didn't explain what I had seen. Who was the woman? Who was the man in the window? And why did they want me to come inside? I never went back to the house again. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The memory of that night, the fear I felt, stayed with me. I still think about it sometimes, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had gone inside. I'm just glad I listened to my gut and got out of there when I did, because I have a feeling that if I had gone inside that house, I wouldn't be here today. The door was open, the house was dark, and when the woman's shadow moved, her real body didn't. I froze on the porch, my breath catching in my throat, holding the bag of food tight. Snow swirled around me, the cold biting at my skin, but I barely noticed. Something was wrong, very wrong. The woman's voice on the phone had been nice, even friendly, but she wasn't coming to the door. She was hiding just out of sight, her shadow showing on the wall at the end of the hall. When she spoke again, soft and polite, the shadow stayed still. A gust of wind howled through the trees, making me jump. My gut told me to leave, to turn around and run. I tried to sound normal. I'll just leave it here, I called out, putting the bag on the step. Silence. Then her voice again, a little stronger. No, please, just bring it inside. My heart beat fast. Everything in me said no. I took a step back. It's fine, really. Have a good night. I turned to go back to my car, to get away from that place. But as I did, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A face, a man's face, staring at me from the window. I felt cold all over. He was standing in the dark room, hard to see through the frost, but his eyes were locked on mine. He didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. My stomach twisted, every part of me screaming to get out. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, my breath coming in short gasps. I got in my car, slammed the door, and locked it. The engine started, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away fast, my tires slipping on the ice. But I had to look in the rearview mirror. The front door was still open, the bag of food still there, and the man still watching. His face was in the window, no expression at all. I turned onto the main road, my heart racing, my mind full of questions. What had I just seen? Why was the door open in the snowstorm? And why did she want me inside? I shivered. I knew one thing. I wasn't going back there. I should have just forgotten about it. I should have pushed it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I walked around my apartment for almost an hour, my mind going over everything. The way the woman's voice sounded, too calm, too careful. The shadow that didn't move. The man in the window. Something was wrong, very wrong. My stomach churned as I picked up my phone. I hesitated, then made the call. The police. I told them about the house, the voice, the open door, and the man in the window. The officer listened quietly. And then his words made me even more scared. That house is abandoned. It's been empty for months. I felt a chill go down my spine. Are you sure? My voice was barely a whisper because I saw. The officer stopped me. We checked. No one lives there. No furniture. No lights. Just an empty house. I held the phone tighter. My mind screamed that it wasn't true, that I had seen them, heard them. They were there. But the officer's voice was firm. There's no one there. If you see anything suspicious again, call us. That was it. The call was done. I stood there in silence, my hands freezing, my body stiff. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, staring at my window, my mind replaying everything over and over. The voice, the shadow, the man in the window. And the worst part, the thought I couldn't get rid of, the fear that ate at me. What would have happened if I had gone inside? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told a friend about the house, about the woman's voice and the man in the window. My friend looked worried. "That's creepy," she said. "You should probably just forget about it." But I couldn't forget. The image of the man's face staring at me from the window was stuck in my head. I kept thinking about what the officer had said, that the house was abandoned. It didn't make sense. I had seen them. I had heard them. They were real, weren't they? Later that day, I decided to drive by the house again. I knew it was a bad idea, but I had to see it for myself. I had to know if it was really empty. As I drove down the street, my heart started pounding. The house looked the same as before, dark and quiet. I parked across the street and got out of my car. The wind was still blowing, and the snow was still falling. I walked across the street and stood in front of the house, and it got even creepier in the daylight. The windows were dark and empty, and the front door was slightly open. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. The inside of the house was pitch black. I took a step inside, then stopped. The air was cold and stale, and there was a strange smell, like something rotting. I took another step, then another. I could hear my heart beating in my ears. I felt like I was being watched. I turned around and ran out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I got back in my car and drove away, my hands shaking. I knew then that the officer was right. The house was empty, but that didn't explain what I had seen. Who was the woman? Who was the man in the window? And why did they want me to come inside? I never went back to the house again. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The memory of that night, the fear I felt, stayed with me. I still think about it sometimes, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had gone inside. I'm just glad I listened to my gut and got out of there when I did, because I have a feeling that if I had gone inside that house, I wouldn't be here today. The feeling of being watched never really went away. Even now, years later, I sometimes get the sense that someone is staring at me, lurking just out of sight. It's a chilling feeling, and it always brings back the memory of that dark house and the man in the window. I still don't know what I saw that night, but I know it was real, and I know that I'll never forget it. The open door, the silent shadow, the man's eyes, they're all etched into my memory. A constant reminder of the night I almost walked into a nightmare. The captain's voice was tight. "Hold on. We're coming in fast." The ferry lurched, and people screamed. The lights on the shore were so close, but I wasn't sure we'd get there. The night had started normally enough. It was a cold winter night, and I needed to get to the other side. I boarded the last ferry, thinking it would be a chilly but normal trip. The wind was howling, and the waves crashed against the dock, but the crew acted like it was just another ride. I found a seat by the window, watching the swirling water below. As the ferry left the dock, it swayed gently, a kind of rhythmic rocking that almost felt soothing. I glanced around at the other passengers. Most were glued to their phones, lost in their own little worlds. They had no idea what was coming. At first, the rocking was just a little annoying, making it a bit hard to get comfortable. But pretty soon, it became something much more than that. A few minutes passed, and the gentle tilting turned violent. The ferry leaned sharply to one side, then slammed back to the other, throwing people against their seats. A few passengers exchanged worried looks, their fingers gripping the armrests tightly. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window for balance, and that's when I saw it. A thin, almost invisible crack creeping across the glass like a spider web. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. A man a few rows behind me muttered something about bad luck, and I had to agree. The next wave hit with a powerful force, and the crack spread quickly, branching out like veins of ice. I spotted a crew member rushing down the aisle, his face pale in the dim light. He forced a smile, but his eyes showed his fear. "Everything's under control," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Just a little bit of rough weather." But his hands were shaking as he spoke, and I knew he was just trying to calm everyone down, including himself. The ferry lurched again, and this time a collective gasp came from the passengers. The ocean was getting angrier, pounding against the small vessel as if it wanted to drag us down into the dark depths. The water outside the window was a swirling black mass, an endless expanse of darkness that made the ferry seem incredibly tiny, a fragile toy being tossed around by a giant. Then the worst happened. The ferry tipped forward, not just a gentle dip, but a sharp, terrifying lurch that sent a wave of panic through the cabin. People screamed, their voices mixing with the creaking of the ship and the crashing of the waves. Bags and other loose items tumbled down the aisle, a chaotic mess that mirrored the fear in our hearts. My stomach lurched as I braced myself against the seat in front of me, the window beside me, groaning under the pressure, the crack growing wider with each passing second. A woman near the front of the ferry started to sob uncontrollably, her fear contagious. The lights flickered ominously, casting spooky shadows across the terrified faces of the passengers. The captain's voice, now strained and urgent, came over the speakers again. "We're behind schedule," he announced, "but we're still pushing through. Just hold on tight." The words were meant to reassure us, but they only made our fear worse. Behind schedule. That meant we were further from safety than we should have been. The storm was getting stronger, the ocean getting angrier, and we were trapped in its powerful grip. Another violent tilt sent a man stumbling into the aisle. He grabbed onto a seat just before he fell, but his face was white, his eyes wide with terror. He, like the rest of us, knew that we were at the mercy of the sea, and the sea wasn't merciful. The ferry kept rocking, each sway more violent than the last. The crew, their faces etched with worry, moved through the cabin, trying to offer some comfort, but their words sounded empty against the storm's fury. Through the chaos and the fear, a faint glimmer of light appeared in the distance. The shore lights. They were dim, almost hidden by the swirling snow and the huge waves, but they were there, a tiny spark of hope in the overwhelming darkness. A wave of relief, fragile and short-lived, washed over me. But the ocean wasn't ready to let us go. It seemed to sense our hope, and it answered with even more anger. The ferry rocked harder than before, crashing into a wave with a deafening boom that shook the whole cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The window next to me was about to break. Another hit, another shuddering jolt, and the world seemed to spin. The captain's voice, now a desperate shout, cut through the noise. "Hold on, we're coming in fast." The dock was visible now, a solid, reassuring thing in the middle of the chaos. But the waves were relentless, pushing us back, trying to keep us away from safety. The ferry lurched forward, driven by the captain's desperate attempts, and slammed against the dock with a sickening crunch of metal on metal. The impact threw passengers forward, their screams echoing through the cabin, a mix of terror and relief. For a moment, everything went silent. The only sound, the gentle lapping of the water against the side of the ferry. Then the doors creaked open, and we stumbled out onto solid ground, our legs weak, our hands shaking. The freezing wind hit our faces, but we didn't care. We were alive. We had made it. I turned back to look at the ferry, still rocking in the waves, the ocean still lashing out at it as if it was furious that we had escaped. And in that moment, I understood the true power of the sea. It didn't care about us. It didn't care if we lived or died. If the storm had lasted just a little bit longer, if the ferry had been just a little bit weaker, we would have been swallowed by the icy water. Another story in the long history of the sea's unforgiving nature. The banging on my door was loud and scary, like someone trying to break in. But when the police came, the man was gone. Just footprints left Footprints all around my house, over and over. It had been snowing for days, everything covered in white. It was the worst storm I'd seen, and my work let us stay home. I was glad. I didn't want to drive on the ice. My roommate had moved out, so the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd turned his old room into an office. That day was normal. I worked, had coffee, and listened to the wind. It was kind of peaceful. Then I heard the knock. It was late afternoon. The storm was still going strong, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole. A man was on my porch. He had a big winter coat on, the hood pulled down. I couldn't see his face well, just the snowy edges of his jacket. He didn't look like a delivery guy or anyone I knew. I opened the door a little. "Can I help you?" I asked. He smiled awkwardly. "Sorry to bother you," he said. My car slid off the road. It stuck in the snow right outside. I don't have my phone. Could I use yours to call for help? Something felt strange, but I didn't want to be rude. I told him to wait, closed the door, and looked out the window. A small SUV was stuck in the snow. He was telling the truth about that. I felt a little better. I grabbed my jacket and boots and went back to the door. I gave him my phone. He thanked me and quickly dialed a number. I stood there watching him. He talked quietly, fast. I heard a few words. "Yeah, still here, waiting." It made me feel uneasy. After a few minutes, he gave me back the phone and smiled quickly. "My brother's coming to get me," he said. "Thanks," I nodded and watched him walk back to his car. I went inside, took off my boots, and tried to work. A few hours passed. It was 7 o'clock p.m. when I looked outside again. The car was still there, and he was still inside. He hadn't moved, just sitting there. I frowned. Maybe his brother was late. Maybe the storm made things slow, but the way he was just sitting there made me nervous. I tried not to think about it. I made dinner, watched TV, and told myself I was worrying too much. But every time I looked out the window, he was still there, sitting in his car, not moving, not even turning on his lights. By 9:30, I was tired. I decided to take a shower. The hot water felt good, and I relaxed a little. Then, all of a sudden, I heard loud, frantic banging. Bang, bang, bang. I froze. My heart started beating fast. The sound was violent, shaking the walls. I turned off the water and listened. Bang, bang, bang. It wasn't just knocking. It was like someone was trying to break in. My hands were shaking as I grabbed a towel and got dressed quickly. Then, just as fast as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stood there, hardly breathing, trying to hear over my heart. All I could hear was the wind outside. Slowly I went downstairs, my stomach in knots. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. I gasped. I ran to the window and looked outside. The car was still there, but it was empty now. He was gone. I felt sick. I grabbed my phone and called the police. There was a man outside my house, I said, my voice shaking. He was banging on my door. I think he's still out there. They told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for them. I checked every window and made sure they were locked. I felt like someone was watching me. Every shadow outside, every sound made me shiver. The minutes felt like hours. Finally, I saw red and blue lights flashing through the storm. A police car pulled up. I ran to the door and let them in. They looked around the house, their flashlights shining through the snow. A few minutes later, one of them called me outside. "You need to see this," he said. I was scared to go out. The officer pointed at the snow. At first, I didn't understand. Then, my blood ran cold. Footprints, lots of them, all around my house. The fresh snow had covered some, but they were still there. Footprints from the car, around the back, around the sides, past my bedroom window, past the office window, past the living room, over and over. The officer looked at me. "Looks like he was watching your house for a while." I shivered. "Where is he now?" I asked quietly. The officer shook his head. "We don't know. The tracks go into the woods, but with the storm, it's hard to tell where he went." I felt sick. He'd been out there for hours, walking around my house, watching me, and I didn't know. The police checked the car's license plate. It was the man who knocked on my door, but they couldn't find him. No phone records, no history. The car was stolen a week before. They looked around, but didn't find him. He just vanished into the snow. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time the wind shook the windows, I woke up. Every little sound made my heart race. The next morning, I checked outside again. The car was gone. The police must have taken it, but the footprints were still there, frozen in the ice, a scary reminder of how close he was. Even now, I don't know what he wanted. Was he going to break in? Was he just trying to scare me? Or was it something worse? I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I still hear those knocks in my dreams. And every time it snows, I check my windows. I check my locks, because I never know if he'll be back. I was miles deep in the woods, alone, when I saw him. No clothes, frost-bitten fingers, and then he vanished, only to reappear much closer, breathing hard, grinning like he had been waiting for me. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo winter fishing day to escape the noise of the city. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the river, and the quiet of the snow-covered forest. The morning started fine. I parked my car at the edge of the woods, checked my gear, and hiked deep into the trail, the snow crunching under my boots. The air was crisp, and everything around me was still. No people, no sounds, just the wind weaving through the trees. I reached the river, set up my gear, and took a deep breath, but the feeling crept in slowly, that tightness in my chest, that tingling on the back of my neck. I could not explain it at first, but something was off, the kind of off that makes your body know before your brain does. Then I saw him, standing across the river on a fallen tree. His skin was almost bluish, his arms too thin, his fingers darkened from what looked like frostbite. He was not shivering, not moving, just standing there, watching. My blood turned cold. The temperature was below freezing, and I was covered in layers. Yet he had nothing. No coat, no shoes. No human could survive this. My first thought was that he needed help, but something in me hesitated. The way he stood, the way his head tilted slightly, almost as if he was studying me, it was not right. I tried to act normal, keeping my movements slow as I reached for my fishing rod, pretending I had not seen him. Maybe if I ignored him, he would go away. I forced myself to breathe, looking down at the water, at my hands gripping the rod. But when I glanced up again, he was gone. My chest tightened, my fingers shaking against the cold. My body screamed at me to leave, to pack my things and go. I moved quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack, my eyes darting toward the trees. I needed to get back to my car. The trail felt longer this time, the silence heavier, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Every few steps, I swore I heard something, a soft crunch of snow, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I turned my head sharply. Nothing. But I knew I was not alone. My heart pounded as I picked up my pace, my boots sinking into the deep snow, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. The wind had picked up, whistling through the branches, But beneath it, I heard it. Footsteps. Close. Too close. My legs burned. My body screaming at me to move faster. But I did not dare look back. Then I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. He was there, standing in the middle of the path, much closer than before. His chest rose and fell like he had been running, steam rising from his skin in the freezing air. And then, slowly, he smirked. That was all I needed. I ran. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but I did not stop. The sound of footsteps behind me quickened, matching mine. He was chasing me. The trail twisted and turned, the snow making it harder to move. But I pushed forward, focused on one thing: my car. I stumbled once, my knee hitting the frozen ground, but the panic drove me forward. I could not let him catch me. Then, through the trees, I saw it. My car. The relief was instant, pushing me to move faster. My hands shook as I yanked the keys from my pocket, fumbling as I reached the door. My fingers finally gripped the handle, and I threw myself inside, slamming the lock. But before I could even breathe, something slammed against the hood. My head snapped up, and my blood turned to ice. He was there. His fists pounded against the metal, his breath fogging up the windshield. His mouth was moving, but I could not hear what he was saying. The car would not start. The battery struggled, clicking uselessly, and his pounding grew louder. His face twisted with rage, his entire body shaking with some kind of madness. My fingers trembled as I turned the key over and over, my heartbeat drowning out every other sound. I thought this was it. This was how I died. Then, in the distance, I saw them, flashing red and blue lights, cutting through the falling snow. The police. His head snapped toward them. And then, just like before, he was gone. The officers searched the area, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Just the deep tracks my own boots had made in the snow. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I saw. I felt him. Even now, I can still hear his fists pounding against the car. Still see the way he smirked in the freezing cold. And worst of all, I still wonder what would have happened if the police had not come. The road was empty. The cold was unbearable. And when the headlights appeared in the distance, I thought I was saved. But as I stepped into that truck, the smell hit me first, like rust or blood And then I saw it. The stains. The plastic-wrapped package in the back. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. It was winter, and I was hitchhiking home after visiting my aunt, who lived several hours away. My car had broken down in the worst possible place, a lonely stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. No gas stations, no stores, not even a single house in sight. Just endless fields and the occasional tree. I was stuck with no cell service, no warm place to wait, and no backup plan. I had hoped someone would stop and help me, but it had been nearly an hour, and I had not seen a single car. The temperature was brutal. The wind stung my face, and my breath came out in visible puffs. No matter how thick my coat was, the cold still sank deep into my bones. I knew I could not last much longer. Then, finally, headlights appeared in the distance. The beams cut through the darkness, growing closer. My heart pounded with both relief and dread. It was a truck, a massive one. It roared down the road like a beast hunting in the night. I hesitated. Every crime story I had ever heard about hitchhiking flashed in my mind like a warning sign. Getting into a stranger's truck at night in the middle of nowhere, it was a perfect setup for something terrible. But I had no choice. I stepped toward the road, stuck out my thumb, and silently prayed that the driver was not dangerous. The truck slowed down, its brakes letting out a sharp screech as it came to a stop. The driver rolled down the window, and warm, smoky air drifted out. He looked rough, mid-50s, thick graying beard, face hardened by years on the road. But his eyes were what unsettled me. They were cold, empty, like he was not really looking at me, but through me. "Where are you headed?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, like he had been smoking since birth. "Just trying to get to the next town," I said, forcing confidence into my tone. He nodded, then jerked his thumb toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." Every instinct told me not to, but then the wind howled, cutting through me like a knife. My fingers were stiff, my toes numb. I knew I would not survive out there much longer. Swallowing my fear, I climbed in. The warmth was immediate, but so was the discomfort. The cab was filthy, covered in dust and old wrappers. The air reeked of cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. The driver said nothing as he pulled back onto the road. He stared straight ahead, hands gripping the wheel like a vice. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I tried to ease the tension. "How long have you been driving?" I asked. No response. My stomach twisted. Something felt wrong. Maybe it was just my nerves, but the way he sat, hunched forward, shoulders tight, like he was waiting for something, it put me on edge. Then the snow started. At first, it was light, barely noticeable, but within minutes, thick flakes poured down, swallowing the road. The truck's wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The driver did not react. His hands stayed locked on the wheel, his face blank. "Pretty bad storm," I muttered, mostly to myself. Still, nothing. Then I noticed something strange. He was not following the main road anymore. He had turned onto a narrow, unmarked path, cutting through the fields. My stomach twisted into a knot. Where are we going?" I asked. "Shortcut," he grunted. His voice was flat, emotionless. I did not believe him. This was not a shortcut. The road was barely a road. The trees on either side were thick, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The snow muffled everything except for the deep growl of the engine. I glanced at him. He was chewing something, gum maybe, but his eyes never left the road. There was something about the way he sat, the way his fingers gripped the wheel, like he was waiting. Then I saw the stains, dark, reddish-brown smudges on the dashboard, near the glove compartment. My pulse skyrocketed. I turned toward the window, my reflection staring back at me, pale, terrified. Then, without warning, the truck jerked to a stop. My body slammed against the seat belt. What are we doing?" I stammered. We were in a clearing, surrounded by thick trees. The road was gone. The driver did not answer. He opened his door, climbed out, and disappeared into the dark. I sat there, frozen, gripping the seat. Then I saw him again. He stepped out from the trees, dragging something large, wrapped in plastic. My stomach turned to stone. The package was long, heavy-looking, and dark stains seeped through the wrapping. He tossed it into the back of the truck like it was nothing. What is that?" I asked, barely whispering. He turned to me, his cold, dead eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, he just stared. Then, slowly, he grinned. "Help me." My throat went dry. "Help you with what?" He reached into the truck and pulled out a shovel. "Get out," he said. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I don't think. Get out." His voice was sharper this time, full of something dark. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle. The wind howled as I stepped outside. "Dig!" he ordered, thrusting the shovel at me. My legs felt weak. My hands trembled. "I dig!" he barked, his voice splitting the night. I took the shovel. The snow was thick, the earth frozen solid beneath it. Every time I pushed the blade in, it felt like I was moving in slow motion. He watched me the entire time. His hand rested inside his coat. I knew there was a weapon in there. I knew if I did not do something fast, I would not be leaving that place alive. That was when I made my decision. I dropped the shovel and ran. Behind me, I heard him curse. His boots crunched through the snow. "Get back here," he roared. I ran harder, lungs burning, legs aching. Then, in the distance, headlights, a car. I stumbled out of the trees, waving my arms and screaming. The car screeched to a halt. "Help me!" I cried. The truck driver stopped chasing me. He stood there, just at the edge of the trees, his figure disappearing into the falling snow. The driver of the car pulled me in and took me straight to the police station. I told them everything, but without a license plate, without any real proof, there was not much they could do. The truck, the clearing, the man, they were just gone. I never saw him again, but I still dream about him. His lifeless eyes, his voice, sharp and commanding, telling me to dig. I do not know what was in that plastic-wrapped package, and I do not want to. But sometimes I think about it. What could have happened if I had not run when I did? And I wonder if somewhere out there, on another lonely road, in the dead of winter, he is still driving, still looking for someone to dig a hole. The snowstorm should have kept everyone inside. But that night, we saw something outside our window. A shadow, then another, moving between the trees. And then we realized they were not just passing through, they were circling us. Winter in Vermont was nice in the daytime, but at night it was creepy. No street lights, no neighbors nearby, just trees and dark. The wind howled, making the house creak like it was alive. My cousin Jack was staying with me for winter break, which made it a little less lonely. We played games, watched movies, and laughed, not thinking about anything else. But everything changed that night. The snow had been falling hard for hours, covering everything in white. We were in the living room, watching TV, sitting by the fire. There was a big window next to us that looked out into the woods. Usually at night, we couldn't see much, just the reflection in the glass. But with the snow and moonlight, we could kind of see the trees. Jack kept looking at the window. At first, I thought he was just watching the snow. But then he leaned forward looking serious. "I think I saw someone," he whispered. I felt uneasy. "Where?" I asked quietly. He pointed to the trees. "Over there, near that big tree." I looked, trying to see through the snow. I didn't see anything. "I think it was just the wind," I said. But Jack didn't seem sure. "Just wait," he said. Then I saw it. A shadow. It moved between the trees. So fast I almost missed it. But Jack gasped, so I knew he saw it too. My heart started beating fast. It was far away, maybe 100 feet, but someone was definitely out there. "Maybe it's a hunter," I whispered, even though that didn't make sense. Who would hunt in this storm? Then another shadow showed up, and another. They were moving in the trees, hard to see in the dark. I felt scared. "How many are there?" I asked, my voice shaky. Jack didn't answer. He just kept watching. Then one of them came out from behind a tree. This one didn't move. It just stood there, looking at the house. I froze, my mind racing. Was it a joke? Were they lost hikers? But I knew they weren't. They were waiting. I gasped as the figure suddenly ran towards us. "Run!" Jack yelled. We jumped up and ran from the couch, almost tripping over each other as we ran upstairs. My heart was pounding. We ran to my dad's room, yelling for him to wake up. He must have heard us because he was up right away, grabbing his shotgun. When we got back downstairs, everything was still outside. The yard was empty. The trees swayed in the wind. My dad frowned, looking at the woods. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked. "Yes," I said, out of breath. "There were a lot of them. One ran right at the house." He waited a minute, then went outside, holding his gun tight. The cold air made me feel even more scared. He walked around, checking the snow. After a while, he sighed. "No footprints," he said. "If someone was running, there would be tracks." That made me feel worse. How could there be no footprints? We saw them. But the snow was still coming down hard. Maybe it covered them already. My dad didn't look like he believed us, but he locked the doors and kept the gun close. That night, he slept in the living room. Jack and I stayed in my room, too scared to be alone. Every sound made us jump. The next morning, the storm was over, and everything was covered in new snow. When we went outside, we found them. Footprints from the woods to the trees by the house, and they went all the way around the house. They had been watching us all night. My dad followed the tracks to the shed, and when he opened the door, we saw something that made me sick. The hunting knives were gone. My dad didn't say anything, just looked at the empty spot where they were. "We're moving in 2 weeks anyway," he said. "We'll be okay," I nodded. But I knew I wouldn't feel safe there anymore, because they were still out there, and they were waiting. My dad yelled at me to get back in the car. He never yells. But when I saw the look on his face, I knew something was wrong. And when he told me what he saw in that man's back seat, I felt sick. I was seconds away from vanishing into the storm. Moving to a new house should have been exciting, but I was dreading the trip. My dad had taken a job in another city, and we had to drive 9 hours to get to our new home. My mom and sisters flew ahead while my dad and I drove the car, but I was not comfortable with the plan. I had just started learning to drive and had little experience on highways, especially in winter. The thought of handling icy roads in a snowstorm made my stomach twist. I checked the weather all day, hoping it would change. It didn't. I tried to convince my dad to leave the next day, but he insisted it would be fine. He said driving in snow wasn't much different, that this would be good practice for me. I didn't argue. We left at 3:00 p.m., just as the sun was starting to set. At first, the drive was fine. The roads were clear, and my nerves slowly settled. But when night fell, everything changed. At around 8:00 p.m., the storm hit. Heavy snowflakes poured from the sky, thick and fast, making it almost impossible to see beyond a few feet. The headlights barely cut through the storm, and the road vanished under a blanket of white. My grip on the wheel tightened until my fingers ached. Every bump, every slip of the tires sent panic through me. I kept expecting my dad to take over, but he didn't. He just sat quietly, watching the road, trusting me to handle it. Then it happened. The tires lost traction. The car skidded sideways, spinning into the oncoming lane. My dad shouted something, but I could barely hear him over the pounding in my chest. I tried to correct the car, but it kept sliding. We scraped against a tree with a loud screech before coming to a shaky stop. For a few seconds, everything was silent. My hands stayed locked on the wheel, bracing for my dad to yell at me. But he didn't. Instead, he sighed and told me to put the car in park so we could check the damage. I stepped out into the freezing cold, the wind slashing against my face. My dad walked around the car and inspected the back passenger door. It had a long, ugly scratch, but that was all. Relief washed over me. Then, headlights appeared through the thick snow. A car was approaching. Its high beams cut through the storm, blinding us. As it got closer, the driver started honking, short, sharp beeps that felt too aggressive. My dad and I turned as the car pulled up beside us. The driver rolled down his window, and I expected him to ask if we needed help. Instead, he spoke like he had been waiting for us. "Cold night, huh?" His voice was too cheerful, too forced. You guys okay? My dad frowned. Yeah, we're fine. But the man didn't leave. He just was there, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. My dad shifted, suddenly tense. Do you need something? Oh, yeah, the man said, like he had just remembered. I think you dropped something about a mile back. Saw it fall out of your trunk. It's in my back seat if you want to grab it. My stomach twisted. That didn't make sense. We packed the trunk ourselves. It was shut tight. I glanced at my dad. He looked just as confused. Are you sure? I asked. We didn't drop anything. I'm positive. The man nodded too much. I was right behind you. Just grab it real quick so I can get going. He motioned toward his back door. Something about his voice, his eagerness, made my skin prickle. I hesitated, but it seemed harmless enough. I took a step toward the car, reaching for the door handle. Get back in the car, now. My dad's voice sliced through the storm like a knife. He never yelled, but his voice was sharp, urgent, terrified. I had never heard him sound like that. I froze, then pulled my hand away from the door. The man's face changed in an instant. The friendly smile disappeared. His entire expression darkened. He was furious. I turned and walked back to our car, quickly, my heart pounding. My dad didn't say another word as he got in and locked the doors. I followed, my hands shaking as I grabbed the wheel. As we pulled away, I glanced back. The man was still there, staring at us, not moving, just watching. The storm swallowed his car as we drove on, but I could still feel his eyes burning into me. The silence in the car was heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just escaped something terrible. Dad, I finally whispered. What was that? Why did you yell? My dad was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Because, he said slowly, when you walked toward his car, I saw something in the back seat. My breath hitched. What did you see? He swallowed hard. 2 men, crouched down, hiding. My whole body went cold. I felt sick. My mind raced, picturing what would have happened if I had opened that door. How fast they would have grabbed me. How quickly I would have disappeared. Are you sure? My voice came out in a whisper. My dad nodded. I know what I saw, and he knew that I saw. I felt like I was going to be sick. We need to call the police. My dad shook his head. We don't have a license plate, no proof. And if we stop now, they might find us first. That realization made my stomach turn. We drove in silence, gripping the wheel so tightly my hands ached. The storm raged on, But all I could think about was that man, his fake smile, the way his eyes went dead the second I didn't do what he wanted. I imagined what would have happened if I had taken one more step, if my dad hadn't stopped me. When we finally reached our new house, I jumped out and checked the trunk. Nothing was missing. Nothing had fallen out. The man had lied. He had never seen us drop anything. He had been waiting, setting a trap. I still see his face sometimes, that too friendly smile, the way his voice changed when I backed away. I still hear my dad's voice, the way it cut through the wind, demanding I stop. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened, if my dad hadn't been there, if I had reached for that door just a second faster. Maybe I would have disappeared into the storm. Maybe they would have taken me somewhere far away, somewhere no one would ever find me. Even now, years later, I don't let myself think about it too much, because the scariest part isn't what almost happened. It's knowing that somewhere, on another cold and empty road, that man is still out there, and he's still looking for someone who won't listen. Hello guys, which story scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. And thanks for listening, everyone. If you stuck around until the end, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. As always, I'm looking for more story ideas, so drop a comment below with any themes or experiences you'd like to hear next. Stay safe out there, and until next time, keep your eyes open.